I came to the bank to close my account, but the banker went pale and said, "Ma'am, have you seen the balance on your account?" There was $27 million. I had never seen that kind of money in my life. When I asked, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Carol Simmons, and before all of this happened, I would have described my life as quietly decent. I was 53 years old, living in a 2-bedroom house in Marietta, Georgia, the kind of neighborhood where people wave from their driveways and nobody asks too many questions. I had worked as a medical billing coordinator for the same hospital system for 19 years. I drove a 2016 Honda Accord. I clipped coupons on Sundays. I was not a woman who expected surprises. My husband, Dennis Simmons, had passed away 14 months before that Tuesday morning. A heart attack, sudden and cruel, right there in the kitchen while he was making coffee. We had been married for 26 years. I won't pretend every one of those years was easy, but I loved him the way you love something that has become part of your own architecture. Quietly, structurally, without fanfare. After he died, I moved through grief the way most people do, slowly, unevenly, with occasional crashes into walls I didn't see coming. That Tuesday, I walked into the First National branch on Roswell Road with one simple goal. I wanted to close the joint savings account Dennis and I had shared. It had maybe $400 in it, left over from a vacation fund we'd never used. I had already moved on from the joint checking account. This was the last financial loose end, and I wanted it gone. I wanted to stop seeing his name next to mine on paper. The teller who helped me was young, maybe 25, with a neat bun and the practiced smile of someone trained to be pleasant under pressure. She typed in the account number I handed her, and then her expression changed. It was subtle. A slight stiffening of the shoulders, a quick glance up at me and then back at the screen. She excused herself and disappeared behind a frosted glass partition. I wasn't alarmed yet. I assumed a bureaucratic hiccup. Maybe the account was flagged as dormant. Maybe I needed additional paperwork because Dennis was deceased. These things happen. I checked my phone, read a few emails, waited. What I did not expect was the branch manager. His name was Mr. Aldridge. 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of careful bearing that suggested he had delivered difficult news before. He shook my hand and asked if I would step into his office. The phrasing was polite but not optional. "Mrs. Simmons," he said once the door was closed. "Before we proceed with the closure, I need to ask, are you aware of the current balance on this account?" I told him yes, around $400, give or take. He turned his monitor to face me. The number on the screen was $27,413,088.52. I remember the exact figure because I stared at it for what felt like a full minute without breathing. $27,413,088.52 in a savings account I thought held our vacation fund. "Ma'am," Mr. Aldridge said carefully, "you did not know about this?" I told him no. The word came out smaller than I intended. He nodded slowly in the way of a man choosing his next words with precision. He told me he could not discuss the source of the funds without authorization and documentation. He told me the account had seen significant activity over the past 3 years. Deposits and partial transfers, multiple transactions, none of them small. He told me that before any closure or withdrawal could proceed, there would need to be a review, and that given the amounts involved, I might want to consult an attorney. I drove home in a kind of trance. I sat in my car in the driveway for 15 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The house was the same as it always was. Dennis's reading glasses still on the side table because I hadn't been able to move them, the faint smell of the candle I'd burned the night before. Everything the same. And yet nothing was. $27 million in our account that I knew nothing about. I am not a suspicious person by nature. I had trusted Dennis completely for 26 years. But sitting in that kitchen, in that quiet house, I began to do something I had never done before. I began to think about all the things I had never thought to question. The occasional business trips he never fully explained. The second phone I'd found once and he'd said was a work phone. The way certain conversations seemed to end just as I walked into a room. Had I been too trusting? Had I confused love with willful blindness? And the question that frightened me most of all, if there was $27 million in a joint account, whose money was it really, and who else knew it was there? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark with the ceiling fan turning overhead and my mind turning faster, pulling at threads I had spent years not pulling. Dennis had been a commercial real estate consultant. That was what he told people at dinner parties, and it was true as far as it went. He had an LLC, Simmons Property Group, registered in Georgia, and he did legitimate work. I had seen the contracts. I had met his clients. For most of our marriage, the income was comfortable but unremarkable. We lived well, not extravagantly. We took one real vacation a year. We had a modest retirement account and a paid-off mortgage. Nothing about our financial life had ever suggested hidden millions. So where had $27 million come from? And when? By 3 a.m, I was at the kitchen table with my laptop, a notepad, and the folder of financial documents I kept in the fireproof box under the bed. The box I had gone through after Dennis died to manage the estate, or what I had believed was the estate. I had found nothing unusual then. A life insurance policy, the retirement account, the checking account, and that joint savings account, which I had noted and set aside to close when I was ready. Had I looked at the balance? I tried to remember. I was certain I had seen a statement once, early in the grief, and it had shown something small. But now I wondered, had I really looked? Or had I seen what I expected to see and moved on? I pulled up the bank's online portal with my own login. The account was there. The balance was there. All 27 million of it, enormous and impossible on my laptop screen in the middle of my quiet kitchen. I clicked into the transaction history. The deposits went back 3 years, large, irregular amounts. $400,000 here, $1.2 million there, coming in from an entity listed only as SRG Capital Holdings. I had never heard that name in 26 years of marriage. The transfers were always in, never out, except for 2 withdrawals in the final 8 months of Dennis's life. One for $800,000 and one for $1.1 million. Both going to an account I didn't recognize. My hands were cold. I thought about calling my son, Michael, who lived in Nashville. But Michael adored his father, and I wasn't ready to say something I couldn't unsay. I thought about calling my sister, Pat, but Pat was a talker, and whatever this was, it needed to stay quiet until I understood it. What I needed was a lawyer, not the estate attorney I had used after Dennis died. He was Dennis's contact, someone Dennis had chosen, and suddenly that felt important. I needed someone new, someone who was mine. I also needed to understand what SRG Capital Holdings was. The next morning, I called in a personal day to work, the first one I'd taken in 2 years, and I drove to the public library instead of opening my laptop at home. Call it instinct, call it the beginning of caution. I did not want to search for this on my home network. SRG Capital Holdings was a Delaware-registered LLC. Beyond the basic registration records, there was very little public information. No website, no news coverage, a registered agent in Wilmington, which meant almost nothing on its own. Thousands of shell companies use Delaware-registered agents. But the name listed as a managing member stopped me cold. Raymond Stokes. I knew that name. Raymond Stokes had been Dennis's college roommate, the best man at our wedding, and someone I had not seen in nearly 15 years after a falling out I had never fully understood. Dennis had told me Raymond had gotten into some questionable business dealings and that he'd had to distance himself. I had accepted that explanation without pressing. I had trusted my husband. Now I sat in a library, Carol, in Marietta, Georgia, and I thought about Raymond Stokes and $27 million and 2 unexplained withdrawals. And I made a decision. I was going to find out everything, quietly, carefully, legally. I was not going to close that account yet. I was not going to tell anyone what I knew until I knew more. And I was going to find a lawyer, a good one. Someone who handled financial fraud and estate litigation, before I took a single visible step. Was I afraid? Yes. My heart hadn't stopped hammering since the bank. But fear, I was learning, is not the same as weakness. Fear is information, and I had just received a great deal of it. I drove home and started writing down every name I could remember from Dennis's life. Every name I'd been too trusting to question before. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor, and a colleague from the hospital had mentioned her once in the context of a nasty divorce. She's the one you want if you need someone who doesn't flinch. That was exactly what I needed. I called her office on a Wednesday morning and had an appointment by Friday afternoon. Her office was in a building in Buckhead, clean and deliberately understated. Sandra herself was in her mid-40s, Nigerian-American, with close-cropped hair and the kind of focused attention that made you feel like every word you said was being filed away for later use. I laid everything out for her in order: the bank visit, the balance, the transaction history, SRG Capital Holdings, Raymond Stokes. I brought printouts. I brought the fireproof box. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Simmons, do you know whether your husband left a will?" He had. I had probated it myself. He had left everything to me and Michael in equal shares. The estate valued at the time of probate at roughly $340,000. The retirement account, the house equity, some personal property, nothing remotely approaching $27 million. Sandra's expression didn't change, but her pen tapped the legal pad once. "The savings account was joint," she said, "which means technically, as the surviving joint account holder, those funds passed to you by operation of law at the moment of his death. They would not have appeared in the probate estate." I had not known that. My estate attorney had apparently not thought to ask about joint accounts beyond the checking. "But the question," Sandra continued, "is where that money came from and whether it represents proceeds from anything that creates legal liability for you or a claim by third parties." She looked at me steadily. "We need to know what SRG Capital Holdings actually did." She suggested a forensic financial investigator she worked with regularly, a former IRS agent named Howard Price. I agreed. We set the terms. I wrote the retainer check with hands that were steadier than I expected. I did not tell Michael, not yet. I went back to my ordinary life, the hospital, the billing codes, the lunch breaks, and I waited. But ordinary life had developed a new quality. The sensation of being watched. It started small. A car I didn't recognize parked twice on my street in 1 week. A dark blue sedan, Georgia plates, Different position each time, but the same car. I was certain of it. A phone call from an unknown number that disconnected when I answered. And then, 10 days after my visit to Sandra's office, a voicemail from a man who identified himself only as a friend of Dennis's, saying he'd heard I was asking questions and he'd love to catch up over coffee. I did not call back. I told Sandra. She told me to document everything. Howard Price worked faster than I expected. 3 weeks after we engaged him, he called me into Sandra's office and set a folder on the table. SRG Capital Holdings had been, for the better part of 7 years, a vehicle for funneling undeclared consulting fees from 3 commercial property developers in Florida and South Carolina. The arrangement was not straightforward tax evasion. It was more sophisticated than that. The developers had been inflating contract costs, skimming the difference through entities like SRG, and distributing the proceeds to a small group of individuals who provided cover in the form of legitimate-seeming consulting agreements. Dennis had been one of those individuals. Raymond Stokes had been the architect of the scheme. The $27 million was not entirely Dennis's. Howard's best estimate, based on the flow of funds, was that approximately $9 million represented Dennis's accumulated share. The rest had been parked in the joint account temporarily, likely because Raymond needed a holding place while restructuring the distribution network, and Dennis had provided it. The 2 withdrawals, $800,000 and $1.1 million, had gone to Raymond Stokes personally through 2 separate accounts. Dennis had known. Dennis had participated. And Dennis, in dying, had left me holding an account containing nearly $2 million that belonged, in Raymond Stokes's view, to Raymond Stokes, along with $25 million more that was, legally, mine. I sat in Sandra's office and I felt the floor shift under my feet. The man I had loved for 26 years had been living a parallel financial life. He had not told me. He had not protected me. He had simply left. And now Raymond Stokes was circling. Point of no return. I knew it when Sandra said, "Carol, we need to talk about your options. Because whoever left you that voicemail already knows you've been asking questions." Sandra's advice was direct. We needed to move before Raymond did. The funds in the joint account were legally mine by survivorship, but that status could be challenged if Raymond, or the federal government, moved first with a civil forfeiture claim or a fraud lawsuit. The window to act was not infinite. The plan had 2 parts. First, we would contact the IRS Criminal Investigation Division voluntarily, through Sandra, disclosing the account and offering Carol Simmons as a cooperative witness, not a target. Voluntary disclosure before an investigation was opened was a documented legal protection. Second, we would petition the probate court to reopen Dennis's estate on the grounds that assets had been omitted from the original filing, which would put the account into a formal legal process that would make any unauthorized outside claim significantly harder to execute. It was not a perfect plan. Nothing about the situation allowed for perfect. But it was clean, and it was legal, and it moved first. Sandra filed the paperwork on a Thursday. Howard Price prepared a financial summary for the IRS contact. By Friday afternoon, Sandra had spoken with an agent named Torres at the Atlanta field office, who received the disclosure without drama and asked us to hold pending an initial review. I went home that evening and cooked dinner. Chicken and rice, the same thing I made every Friday for years. I sat at the kitchen table and ate it alone and thought, I have done something irreversible today. There was grief in it because irreversible meant Dennis was no longer someone I could protect from judgment. But there was also something else. something I hadn't felt in 14 months. Agency. I had done something. I had chosen. I slept 5 hours that night, which was the best I'd managed since the bank visit. The call came on Saturday morning. The voice on the phone was smooth, Southern accented, and utterly familiar from 26 years of holiday dinners and wedding photos. Raymond Stokes. He did not waste time on pleasantries. Carol. Just my name, said in a particular tone, the tone of a man who believed his patience was a form of generosity. I think you and I need to talk about what you've been doing this week. He knew. Of course he knew. He had contacts, networks. Dennis had once described Raymond as a man who kept his fingers in everything. The question was, how much he knew specifically. I kept my voice level. Raymond, I don't think there's anything for us to discuss. There was a pause. Then, I'm going to say this once, as a friend. Whatever you've filed or said to whoever you've spoken with, walk it back. You don't understand the full picture. Dennis made certain agreements. Those agreements don't disappear because he did. I asked him what kind of agreements. The kind, he said, that could make your life very complicated. The kind that could make the IRS look at you, not just at the account. You're holding funds you didn't earn and didn't know about, or that's what you claim. How does that look, Carol? An innocent woman or a woman who's been quietly benefiting for years and is now trying to distance herself? It was a threat framed as concern, the most dangerous kind. I told him I had an attorney and that all future communications should go through her. I ended the call. Then I sat down on the couch and stayed very still for about 10 minutes because my legs were not quite reliable. Sandra, when I called her, was unsurprised. He's testing what you know and how scared you are, she said. The fact that he called directly instead of through his own attorney tells me he doesn't have clean legal standing. If he did, he'd have lawyers doing the talking. She advised me to document the call in writing and send her a summary immediately, which I did. 2 days later, through Sandra's office, Raymond Stokes' attorney made contact, requesting a meeting to discuss the estate matters in a collegial manner. Sandra declined politely and firmly. We heard nothing more that week, but the threat had landed in me and stayed there, pulsing quietly. He was right that my position could be made to look complicated. That was the cruelest part of it. Dennis's secrets had become my exposure. I took 4 days off work the following week. I went to my sister Pat's house in Savannah, told her only that I was dealing with some difficult estate business and needed to rest. I sat on her porch and watched the marsh and let myself be still. I was not defeated. I was not going to be defeated. But I was going to let myself be a human being for 4 days before I went back to the fight. When I came back from Savannah, there was a casserole on my porch, chicken and broccoli, covered in foil, with a card that said, "Thinking of you, Diane." Diane Ashworth had been my neighbor for 11 years. I stood on the porch holding that dish and thought about how small acts of ordinary kindness can undo you in moments of extraordinary stress. I cried a little. Then I went inside, put the casserole in the refrigerator, and checked my email. There was a message from Dennis's sister, Lorraine. Lorraine Simmons lived in Charlotte and had never been a warm presence in my life. She was cordial in the formal sense, Christmas cards, birthday texts, but there had always been a current of something underneath that I'd never quite named. Competition, maybe, or judgment. After Dennis died, she'd come to the funeral and stayed 2 days and left without offering much. I hadn't heard from her in months. The email was friendly, warmer than she'd ever been, actually, which was the first thing that struck me. She wrote that she'd been thinking about me, that grief was so hard that she wanted to come visit and take me to dinner and talk about Dennis and what comes next for you. She said she had some thoughts that might help. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Sandra with a 1-line note. I believe this is connected. Advice? Sandra called within the hour. She had been expecting something like this. Raymond Stokes and Lorraine Simmons had known each other for decades. Raymond had been Dennis's oldest friend, and Lorraine was Dennis's sister. It would not be unusual for them to be in contact, and it would be entirely characteristic of Raymond's approach to send someone Carol might trust, someone with an emotional claim rather than coming directly again himself. "What does she want?" Sandra asked. "She says she wants to talk about what comes next for me," I said. "She wants to know what you know and what you're planning," Sandra said, "and she may be carrying an offer." I wrote back to Lorraine. I thanked her for thinking of me, said I appreciated it, and told her I was in the middle of some legal business related to Dennis's estate that kept my schedule unpredictable, but that I'd be in touch when things settled. Polite, opaque, completely non-committal. She replied within 20 minutes. Very warm, very understanding, absolutely no pressure. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need. I'm here whenever you're ready." The speed of the reply told me everything. She was waiting by her phone. I did not respond again. What I did do in those weeks was find my footing in the world outside the legal battle. Sandra had suggested practically that I find a therapist, not for crisis intervention, but for the sustained stress of a prolonged legal process. I took the advice. A woman named Dr. Renee Coates, whose office was near the hospital. She was practical, dry-humored, and had worked with clients in financial trauma before. Seeing her every 2 weeks became an anchor, and I talked to Diane Ashworth, not about the full situation. I kept the financial details private on Sandra's advice, but about the loneliness of grief, about feeling like the person you thought you knew had turned out to have rooms you'd never been allowed into. Diane was a retired school teacher and a good listener, and she said something in one of those porch conversations that stayed with me. "Carol, the fact that you didn't know doesn't make you foolish. It means he worked very hard to make sure you didn't know. That's on him, not you." I had needed to hear that. I hadn't realized how much until she said it. Agent Torres at the IRS reached out through Sandra with a preliminary update. They had opened a formal investigation into SRG Capital Holdings. My cooperative status was noted and protected. It would be a long process, she said. These things always were. Raymond's side went quiet. No more calls, no more emails through intermediaries. But I was not naive enough to think he'd given up. He was watching, recalculating. Men like Raymond Stokes did not walk away from $27 million without trying every available door first. I locked my doors. I documented everything. I called Sandra every week, and I waited with a steadiness that surprised even me. There is a particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of danger, but from the decision, the clear, settled decision that you will not be moved. I had made that decision. I was not going to be moved. They came on a Sunday. I saw the car pull up from the kitchen window, a rented silver SUV, the kind you get at the airport. Lorraine got out first, in a cream-colored blouse and the particular expression she wore when she was performing graciousness. Raymond Stokes came around from the passenger side. I hadn't seen Raymond in 15 years. He was heavier now, silver-haired, well-dressed in the specific way of men who want you to understand that money is not a concern. He carried a small gift bag. I watched them walk up my front path. I took a slow breath. Then I opened the door before they could knock. Carol. Lorraine opened her arms. You look wonderful. I did not step back to let them in. I stood in the doorway and said pleasantly, Lorraine, Raymond, I wasn't expecting you. We should have called, Raymond said with a smile that had probably worked on a great many people. But we were worried about you. We're family, Carol. That doesn't stop because Dennis is gone. They were not family, but I stepped aside and let them in because I wanted to know what they'd come to say and because Sandra had told me, if they approach you in person, let them talk, document everything, commit to nothing. We sat in my living room. Lorraine admired the room in that way that means you're assessing it. Raymond set the gift bag on the coffee table. Wine I could see and some chocolates. A performance of normalcy. Raymond spoke first. He was, I had to grant him, skilled. He talked about Dennis, about their friendship, about how much Dennis had loved me, about how complicated Dennis's business life had become in his final years, and how Raymond had tried to protect him. He framed everything in the language of loyalty and family burden, of decisions made under pressure, of good men caught in difficult circumstances. The money in that account, he said carefully, is complicated. Carol, I think you understand that. There are parties, and I don't mean me specifically, who have legitimate claims to portions of it. And the way you're handling this, through legal channels, through the government, it doesn't protect you. It exposes you. Dennis would not have wanted this. There it was. Dennis would have wanted you protected, Lorraine added, on cue. Her voice was soft. He loved you. Whatever mistakes he made, he loved you. And right now, the choices you're making could take everything from you. The house, your reputation, your relationship with Michael. Is that what you want? I looked at her, then at Raymond. I thought about 26 years of marriage and a savings account I hadn't known existed. I thought about a voicemail from a man who wouldn't give his name. I thought about Lorraine's email sent 20 minutes after I declined. Raymond, I said, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. Are you asking me to withdraw from cooperation with a federal investigation? He shifted. I'm asking you to consider a private resolution, something that protects everyone. And if I don't? The smile didn't disappear, exactly, but something behind it went cold. I'm hoping you'll be reasonable, he said. Dennis was, until he wasn't, and then things got complicated for him too. The implication was not subtle. Dennis's heart attack had been sudden. I filed that sentence away in a part of my mind that had gone very quiet and very cold. Lorraine put her hand on my arm. Carol, please. We don't want this to become adversarial. We want to help you. There's a number, she glanced at Raymond, that we think would be fair. For you, personally. Something that recognizes your position. They were offering me money. A portion of the money that was already legally mine, in exchange for withdrawing my cooperation and handing them access to the rest. I stood up. I appreciate you coming, I said. I'll let my attorney know you visited. Please direct any further communication to her office. Raymond's composure slipped. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for drama. But the pleasant mask developed an edge. He stood slowly. You're making a mistake, Carol. Possibly, I said, but it's mine to make. They left. I locked the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment, my back against the wall. Was I frightened? Yes. Raymond's comment about Dennis until he wasn't was going to sit in my chest for a long time. These were not simply greedy people. These were people who had lived for years in the space between legal and illegal and had learned to be comfortable there. But the fear did something unexpected. It didn't weaken me. It made everything cleaner, clearer. I picked up my phone and called Sandra and told her every word of what had just happened. I was done being reasonable with unreasonable people. The deposition took place in February, 7 months after my first visit to Sandra's office. It was held in a federal building in downtown Atlanta, a conference room with a long table, fluorescent light, and the specific atmosphere of rooms where things are made official. Present were Agent Torres and a colleague from IRSCI, a DOJ attorney named Whitfield who had joined the case 3 months in, Sandra, Howard Price, and me. Raymond Stokes was deposed separately. His attorney had been negotiating the terms of that session for weeks. I had been deposed first, 6 weeks earlier. I had answered every question Sandra and I had prepared for, and some we hadn't, and through all of it, I had told the truth, because the truth was the only thing I had that was clean. When it was over, Whitfield had looked at me across the table and said, "Mrs. Simmons, your cooperation has been noted and will be reflected in our findings." That was all. But Sandra, in the elevator going down, had allowed herself a small smile. I held on to that smile in the weeks that followed. It was small fuel, but it burned steadily. Today was Raymond's deposition. I was not present for it. That wasn't how these things worked. But Sandra had arranged to be informed, and I waited in a coffee shop 2 blocks away with my phone on the table and a cup of coffee I barely touched. The morning light came through the window at a low angle. People around me talked about ordinary things. I sat very still and waited. What happened in that room, I learned in pieces over the following hours and days. Raymond Stokes arrived with 2 attorneys and the confidence of a man who had navigated difficult rooms before. He answered the first round of questions carefully, maintaining the framework he had apparently built over months of preparation. He was a business consultant. SRG Capital Holdings was a legitimate advisory firm. The fees paid were for services rendered, and he had no knowledge of any fraudulent activity by the developers who had engaged him. Then Agent Torres's colleague introduced the documents Howard Price had assembled, including wire transfer records, internal emails between SRG and the 3 developer firms, and a series of text messages recovered from a forensic analysis of Dennis's second phone, the one I had seen once and been told was a work phone. The texts were between Dennis and Raymond. They were specific. They used language that was in some places almost comically incriminating, references to the usual arrangement, to moving the funds before Q4, to making sure Carol's name is on it so it looks clean. That last phrase was the one that struck me hardest when Sandra read it to me later, sitting in her car in the parking garage because neither of us wanted to walk back into public with that sentence still hanging in the air. Making sure Carol's name is on it so it looks clean. Dennis had put the money in our joint account not to share it with me, not to protect it for us, but because my name made the account look like an ordinary household savings vehicle. I had been used as cover for years, without my knowledge or consent. I had loved him. I had grieved him. And he had done this. When the texts were placed in front of Raymond Stokes, his composure cracked. Not all at once. He was practiced enough to attempt a recovery. He said the messages were taken out of context. He said Dennis had sometimes used imprecise language. He said "looks clean" referred to regulatory compliance, not concealment. But the DOJ attorney, Whitfield, had prepared for exactly this. She walked Raymond through each message in sequence, asking him to explain the context of each one. And with each answer, his prior answers became contradictions. He had claimed not to know Dennis had concerns about the arrangement. A message existed in which Raymond explicitly reassured Dennis that the exposure is manageable. He had claimed SRG's clients engaged him for legitimate consulting. An email from one of the developers referred to Raymond's arrangement fee for help adjusting the reported contract values. His attorneys called for 2 breaks. Raymond returned from each one, looking slightly less certain than before. A man whose carefully rehearsed narrative was being dismantled one document at a time, in a room where there was nowhere to redirect the conversation and no audience to perform for. By mid-afternoon, his voice had changed register, tightening in a way that betrayed the effort of maintaining control. He had built his life on charm and maneuver, and neither was useful here. The documents did not care about his tone. By the time the session ended, Raymond Stokes had contradicted himself on 7 documented points, had been shown evidence that directly refuted 4 of his central claims, and had invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 11 times in the final hour, which, as Sandra explained to me later, is not a legal admission of guilt, but is certainly an acknowledgement that honest answers would be damaging. Lorraine was interviewed as a material witness. She had known about the arrangement. Emails showed Raymond had kept her informed as a means of ensuring her cooperation in managing Dennis during his final years, when Dennis had apparently grown nervous and begun talking about stopping. Her cooperation had been transactional, not incidental. When she was shown those emails, I was told, she cried. I did not know what to do with that information. I filed it away and left it alone. 2 days later, Sandra called me with the formal finding. Carol Simmons was classified as a non-culpable third party. I had not known. There was no evidence that I had ever benefited knowingly from the scheme or participated in its operation. I sat with that for a long time after the call. The relief was enormous and complicated, because being cleared is not the same as being unhurt. It is not the same as having the husband you thought you had. It is not the same as 26 years meaning what you believed they meant, but it was something. It was the truth, on record, in a federal building in Atlanta, and the truth, as it turned out, was exactly what I needed. The indictment came down in April. Raymond Stokes was charged on 6 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, money laundering, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 2 counts of structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. His 2 attorneys immediately began negotiating, which Whitfield told Sandra was a sign they understood the weight of the evidence. There would be no dramatic trial, most likely. There would be a plea, with sentencing guidelines that Whitfield estimated would result in a federal prison term of 7 to 10 years, and a civil forfeiture order requiring Raymond to disgorge the proceeds attributable to his scheme. I read the indictment document that Sandra sent me, all 31 pages of it. I read it at the kitchen table in Decatur. I had already begun the process of looking for the new house, with a cup of tea that went cold beside me. Seeing it written out in the flat, precise language of federal law was different from knowing it in my own mind. It made it real in a different register. These were not my fears or my suspicions or my grief. These were facts, enumerated, sourced, and signed. Lorraine was not charged criminally. Her involvement, while knowing, had not risen to the level of active participation under the statute, but she was named as a relief defendant in the civil proceeding, and the court ordered the disgorgement of approximately $340,000 in funds she'd received from Raymond over the years, framed at the time as gifts, now established as scheme proceeds. Her attorney filed 2 motions challenging the order. Both were denied. The question of the $27 million was resolved through a careful, months-long process between Sandra, the DOJ, and the IRS. Of the total, approximately $11.2 million was determined to be directly traceable to fraudulent proceeds, the inflated contract fees, and the money laundering that had cycled through SRG. That portion was subject to civil forfeiture and would be applied toward penalties owed by the developers and by Raymond personally. The remaining balance, approximately $16.2 million, represented Dennis's legitimate consulting income accumulated over the same period, interest earned on the account, and funds that could not be directly traced to fraudulent transactions with sufficient evidentiary certainty. Under the law, and given my status as a non-culpable surviving joint account holder, that portion was mine. $16,200,000. I want to be honest about what I felt when Sandra told me the final number. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel wealthy in the way people imagine wealth feels. I felt the weight of it, the moral weight, the practical weight, the strange and heavy knowledge that this money existed because my husband had participated in something wrong and had chosen never to tell me. There was grief wound through the relief. There was anger still, though it had become quieter and more settled than the sharp thing it had been in those early weeks. There was the particular exhaustion of a person who has held enormous tension for a long time and is only now being allowed to set it down. But I was not going to pretend the money wasn't there, and I was not going to be careless with it or guilty about it or give it to people who had no legal claim to it. I established a trust with Sandra's guidance and a financial advisor she recommended named Marcus Webb. The trust was structured conservatively, a portion in treasury instruments, a portion in a diversified fund, a small allocation for immediate living expenses, and a designated charitable giving account, which felt important to me. I gave a substantial amount to a community health foundation that supported the kind of hospital system I'd worked in for 19 years. I set aside a portion for Michael. The rest I intended to manage slowly, without drama, and without the kind of sudden decisions that grief and windfall can combine to produce in dangerous ways. Marcus was patient and thorough, and I trusted him in the way I now trusted people. Carefully, with verification, and not all at once. I left my job at the hospital, not immediately. I stayed through the end of the fiscal year, trained my replacement carefully, and left with 2 decades of goodwill intact. My department head cried a little at the goodbye lunch. I had genuinely loved the work, but I no longer needed to work for financial survival, and there were things I wanted to do with the time I had. Raymond Stokes pleaded guilty in September to 4 of the 6 counts. The plea agreement included a sentencing recommendation of 8 years in federal prison and the civil forfeiture of assets totaling $14.3 million. His house in Buckhead was among them. So were 3 properties in Florida. The Porsche that he'd apparently driven to my house in, I learned this detail later from Howard, who mentioned it with the dry satisfaction of a man who appreciated a complete outcome, was also seized. He would be 63 when he was released if he served the full term. I thought about the man who had stood in my living room with a gift bag and a smile, telling me Dennis would have wanted me protected. I thought about the sentence things got complicated for him too, and what he had meant by it, and what he had believed that sentence would do to me. It had done nothing except confirm what I already understood about him. Lorraine called me twice after the civil order was entered. I did not answer either time. Whatever she wanted to say, apology, accusation, plea for understanding, I was not in a position to receive it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That was a decision I reserved the right to make on my own timeline, without pressure and without performance. What I felt in those weeks after the final resolution was not the clean, cinematic satisfaction of a story that ends with trumpets. It was quieter than that. It was the particular piece of a person who has done the right. The first thing I did, the very first thing, the week after the trust was finalized, was buy a plane ticket to Portugal. I had always wanted to go. Dennis had always found a reason to delay. Too busy, wrong season, maybe next year. I had accepted those reasons the way I had accepted many things, quietly, without pressing, without asking whether my own wants deserved equal weight in the conversation. Now there was no one to negotiate with, and no reason to wait. I booked a small apartment in Lisbon for 3 weeks, and I went alone, with a carry-on bag and a Portuguese phrasebook I practiced with every morning at the kitchen table before I left. I did not take meetings or calls. I walked. I sat in small restaurants and ordered things I couldn't fully pronounce and ate them slowly, without hurrying. I watched the light on the Tagus River in the evenings and let myself exist without agenda. It was the first real rest I had taken in, perhaps years, and I discovered, sitting on that bench by the water, that rest is not emptiness. It is the thing that fills you back up when you have spent too long pouring yourself out. I came back to Atlanta in June and began making changes with the same steadiness I'd applied to the legal battle, methodically, without rush. I sold the house on Creekview Drive. It was the right house for the life Dennis and I had shared, and that life was over. I bought a smaller place in Decatur, close enough to the city to have a neighborhood life but quiet enough to think. A screened porch, a garden I actually tended, a room I designated as a study, which I painted the exact shade of green I'd wanted in the old house, and Dennis had always vetoed. I painted it myself on a Saturday, with the windows open and music playing, something I hadn't done in years. And when I finished, I stood in the doorway and looked at the color on the walls and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was still tight. It was just paint, but it was mine, entirely and without negotiation. Michael came down from Nashville in August, and we spent 4 days together. The first 4 days we'd spent in the same place since his father's funeral. I told him the full story over 2 evenings on the back porch with iced tea. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. He was angry at his father, a clean, clear anger that I recognized because I had felt it too. He was also, I think, grieving for a second time, for a version of his father that hadn't fully existed. I held space for all of that. I didn't try to soften or explain Dennis away. I just told the truth and let him sit with it the way I had learned to sit with difficult things, without rushing toward resolution. By the time Michael left, something had shifted between us. We started talking more, not about the case, but about everything else. His work, his relationship, the things he was uncertain about at 32. I had more time to listen now. I used it. We fell into the habit of a Sunday phone call, easy and unhurried, and that small rhythm became one of the better things in my week. We were building something new between us, and that felt like one of the few genuine gifts that had come out of a very painful year. I began volunteering at the community health clinic affiliated with my old hospital. Not in billing, but in patient navigation, helping people understand their options, their rights, their paperwork. I was good at it. It turned out that 19 years of learning how systems work from the inside is useful when you're helping people who feel lost inside those same systems. I spent 3 mornings a week there. It was the most satisfying work I had done in a long time, and it reminded me that purpose does not require crisis to exist. It just requires attention. Diane Ashworth and I became genuine friends, the kind that required no performance. We took a cooking class together in the fall, Moroccan food, which we both loved and neither of us could make. We were terrible at it the first time and laughed until we could barely stand, which is, I've come to believe, one of the necessary nutrients of a livable life. We signed up for the second session without even discussing it. We simply assumed we'd both go back. That assumption, small, unspoken, mutual, was its own kind of warmth. Dr. Coates and I continued meeting monthly, which had shifted from stress management into something more like intentional reflection. I was learning things about myself, my patterns, my accommodations, the ways I had made myself smaller to maintain a peace that had never been as real as I believed. That work was slow and sometimes uncomfortable and entirely worthwhile. And Raymond Stokes, he reported to a federal correctional facility in North Carolina in November. I read the news item and set my phone face down on the table and went out to water the garden. There was nothing more I needed to feel about him. He had assembled his own consequences, year by year, choice by choice. The system had simply caught up. Lorraine Simmons, I heard through a mutual acquaintance later that spring, had sold her house in Charlotte and moved in with a family member after the disgorgement order and associated legal fees. She was, by all accounts, not well. The financial stress had compounded other difficulties. I did not feel satisfaction at this exactly. I felt the flat sadness of waste, of a person who had chosen the wrong side of things and was now living in the consequences. There had been a moment, many moments probably, when she could have chosen differently. She hadn't. That was her story to carry, not mine. What I felt about my own life was something I had not felt for a long time and hadn't expected to feel again. I felt like myself, not the woman I'd been before Dennis, or the woman I'd become inside the marriage, or the woman I'd been in the terrible year of grief. Something further along than all of those, a version of Carol Simmons who had been forged in a difficulty I hadn't chosen and had come through it knowing things about herself she hadn't known before. I walked to the porch some evenings and watched the neighbors and the light, and I thought, I did not ask for any of what happened to me, but I am who I am because of what I chose to do about it. That felt like enough, more than enough. It felt finally like mine. If you found yourself standing where I stood, $27 million, a dead husband's secret, and a dangerous man at your door, what would you do? I'd love to know. Leave a comment. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Thank you for listening.